they have absolutely zero success for years already. And south of Avdiivka, they also moved several meters. But comparing to the losses they sustained during this week, there's no one in this world who will justify such losses in return for just several hundred meters.
Hello and welcome to Frontline for Times Radio with me, James Hansen. Today, we're getting an on-the-ground update from Ukrainian forces as they continue to repel Russian attacks. I'm delighted to be joined by soldier and regular YouTuber reporting on the situation, operator Starsky, who's in Kiev at the moment, having returned from the front last month. Operator Starsky, thank you so much for joining us on Frontline today.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure.
I wanted to start by just talking about some reports we've had this morning that Russia has switched to bombing attacks around Avdiivka after their ground assault appeared to have stalled. Now, strategically, you could argue this is good news for Ukraine, but will the troops be more concerned about the threats of an aerial campaign?
Yes, of course, because it's a very, I would say, typical for the Russian troops. At first they attempt to capture the area using massive number of personnel and armored vehicles and tanks, and then when they burn, they literally switch to bombing and destroying everything, like they did in Rubizhne and Severodonetsk and Mariupol and in Bakhmut, basically. So they literally start erasing buildings, erasing city blocks. And that's what we see currently in Avdiivka. Currently, they have small success in the north of Avdiivka, near Krasnohorivka. There are two Krasnohorivkas actually in that area. One is on the south, but there they have absolutely zero success for years already. And south of Avdiivka, they also moved several meters. But comparing to the losses they sustained during this week, there's no one in this world who will justify such losses in return for just several hundred meters.
Other than Vladimir Putin, it would seem.
Yeah, of course.
How confident are you then, Operator Starsky, that the Ukrainians can continue to repel these assaults on Avdiivka? Because the Russians seem pretty determined to keep launching them.
Yeah, currently it's their goal number one until the end of the year, because first of all they wanted to capture this settlement for Putin's birthday. Basically, generals promised that he will have a birthday gift, but they failed, and now they want to capture it by the end of the year, basically to give him like a New Year gift already. I'm not sure if he even receives like a Christmas gift. In Russia, it's in January. But we will see. Of course, we're doing everything we can, and of course, in such situations, we have the goal of inflicting as much casualties to the enemy as possible, like it was in Rubizhne and Bakhmut, for example, where they lost almost 50,000 men, countless numbers of tanks and armored vehicles and artillery, of course. But from what we see now, the situation is dynamic, meaning that, for example, in Butovka mine, which is east of Avdiivka, actually Ukrainians repelled and pushed Russians back several hundred meters. So the line is not stable at this moment, and the situation is very dynamic.
Is there not a danger, though, that Ukraine becomes so focused in defending Avdiivka that they miss out on opportunities to push ahead with their counteroffensive further south?
Same counts for Russians, because, for example, in Bakhmut, we have tactical success in multiple areas. In the village of Avdiivka, for example, our troops continue moving forward, liberating areas. So same works for Russians as well.
Just explain why Avdiivka is of such strategic significance as well as symbolic significance, because of course it's not far from Donetsk. Donetsk far bigger. Why is Avdiivka so important?
It's a symbolic place for Russians. Avdiivka wasn't taken by Russian terrorist troops, by their hybrid army since 2014 until this day. And also, Avdiivka opens road towards Pokrovsk and towards the rest of the Donetsk Oblast that Russians uh, promised promised to capture anyways. So this is why they do it. At the same time, they're losing Bakhmut, and probably they want to switch focus because if they lose Bakhmut, it will be incredible strike on Russian image or reputation if they have it. Because Bakhmut, again, it was very, very symbolic, as we all remember. They tried to capture it for about a year, and they lost incredible number of people there, including their convicts from the Wagner terrorist group, and multiple high-ranked officers. So this is the situation.
I want to ask you about Ukraine's attempts to cross the Dnipro River. It appears that has happened successfully, and Ukraine have now held some territory. What is the latest from your understanding?
So the latest information that we have is that our recon groups managed to cross the river and establish control over a small portion of the opposite bank, and they also captured and they hold control over this territory, basically preparing the foothold for the Ukrainian troops. Cannot talk much about it, unfortunately, due to the OPSEC, but the situation there is very promising for us.
Obviously, temperatures are now really beginning to drop in Ukraine, and we're moving towards winter. How would you sum up each side's preparedness for the winter months?
Speaking of Ukrainian civilians, for example, we will be much more prepared for this winter comparing to the previous one when we had those massive blackouts. And despite our power grid here in Ukraine, in more or less protected cities, was not restored 100%. Because the damage was tremendous. We remember that Russians were shooting hundreds of missiles during some of the strikes. But nonetheless, we keep preparing, making sure that even during blackouts, people will have access to things like internet, communications, which is very important, and of course, our invincibility points will be operating as well. We will have more of them. Again, they're equipped with Starlink systems and other things, so people can have warm food and basically save themselves from cold. Regarding our troops, well, all the problems that Ukrainian army faces at this point during winter, or will face during winter, basically Russians will be facing this very problem as well, because, for example, if tanks cannot move due to the terrain condition, right? Same works for Russians as well. We have unfortunately almost similar weapons and vehicles, but at the same time, I think that motivation will be playing the main role here. And of course, Ukrainians have tremendous motivation, and the main motivation for us is that we're fighting for our survival. Russians cannot want to kill us more than we want to live.
Do you think that the winter months and the winter conditions may lead to a prolonged, almost stalemate? We've seen a relative lack of progress from both sides in recent months. Many people are saying the Ukrainian counteroffensive hasn't necessarily gone as well as people were hoping, and Russia maybe not making the gains that they would have hoped to have made in places like Avdiivka. Do you think that's going to continue over the winter months as both sides dig in?
We will see something similar, I think, to the situation like last winter. But at the same time, in such conditions, first of all, aviation will be much more active. It's much more convenient flying in the winter. I would say regardless of the weather condition, but of course it matters as well. And at the same time, our artillery counter artillery combat will be very important and very, very active. Probably we'll see Ukrainian army using more cluster munitions against Russian personnel, because all this time Russians having much more ammo, much more artillery, much more shells for their artillery. They were, of course, striking our personnel. We could not spend much our shells on Russian personnel because we had much more important targets. But now, currently, I think the situation will change. There's already cases when Ukraine spent more artillery shells on Russians than Russians shooting at Ukrainians.
That's interesting. We've had reportedly recently the use of ATACMS missiles by Ukraine on Russian targets with some significant success, it would seem. Is that the kind of thing you think we can expect to see more of?
Yes, of course, because Ukraine was promised more ATACMS missiles. Basically, we were promised that Ukraine will be supplied by ATACMS on a regular basis. Which means that Russian invaders will not be able to feel safe anywhere in Ukraine.
Obviously, you're speaking to us from Kiev at the moment, Operator Starsky. A lot of people remember Russia's attacks on energy infrastructure there last winter. Are you expecting that to repeat itself again over the winter months?
Yes, we have information that Russians are concentrating their long-range missiles and ballistic missiles and strike drones, preparing for those strikes that we will expect in winter. That's why we prepare our air defense systems and our mobile groups. We will have, of course, more mobile groups hunting drones and Russian cruise missiles as well.
And are the air defense systems of Ukraine better, stronger than they were last year?
Yes, they are. Also, we were promised by our allies, like Germany, for example, that we will receive more anti-air systems. We noticed that Hawk systems, for example, work very, very well against Russian drones, because Russian drones, of course, they can be shot down using missiles, but missiles cost much more than Russian / Iranian drones. At the same time, what is cost of life? It's priceless, right? So we have to use every measure that we can use in order to protect our citizens. But at the same time, we can shoot them down much more efficiently using our mobile groups and such systems as Hawk, for example.
You mentioned Germany expected to provide, I think it's £1.4 billion worth of support to boost the Ukrainian air defences. And we talked as well about the US provided ATACMS missiles. What other military hardware and equipment does Ukraine really need at the moment?
I would say we need everything that can be provided to us in order to win this war as soon as possible. The more weapons and the more anti-air systems, more artillery systems we have right now, the faster this war will end and more people will survive, obviously. I would say that at this point, we don't need as many, let's say, tanks as we did last year. Currently, we face the situation where, Russian use plenty of mines. Currently, Ukraine is the most mined country in the world, unfortunately. That's why we cannot use as many vehicles as we anticipated due to the anti-tank mines, anti-personnel mines. So I think in our case, we require a lot of aviation to provide combat air support for our attacking troops. We need to suppress Russian artillery. We need to suppress Russian aircraft that are very, very active in the combat area. And this will be a huge boost to our counteroffensive because, Ukraine is being often criticized for slow counteroffensive. At the same time, what kind of NATO army would counter-attack with little to none combat air support? Uh, Ukrainians have the task that would not be accepted by any NATO army, and we're steadily working and continue doing what we started.
It's interesting you mentioned the ground offensive there and the counter offensive, which, as you say, has received some, I'm not sure criticism, but certainly a bit of disappointment from many people in the West that it hasn't advanced more quickly. Do you purely put that down to the lack of aerial support?
It's one of the things. Ukrainian army was trained according to NATO standards, and according to their standards, of course, we have to use combined troops. And one of the important elements is using of attack aviation, providing the combat air support for our land troops. That is something that we lacked since last year because, unfortunately, we cannot build our attack aircraft out of thin air. And because of the war, we keep losing our airplanes as well. So we need more advanced weapons. We saw, for example, that Ukraine using more advanced Western artillery can reach, let's call it parity, if not in terms of numbers, but in terms of quality. I mean, precision of fire, range of fire, and it's the same about the Western airplanes that our pilots can operate. That are much more advanced, that use long-range missiles and high precision bombs and weapons provided that can be provided by our allies.
How worried are you, though, Operator Starsky, by the rate of support and the level of support being provided by the West in terms of supplies? We know that President Biden, we know the UK government, we know many other European allies are still being incredibly supportive. But, for example, in the US, there is a debate among some within the Republican Party as to whether the level of support for Ukraine is justified. President Biden is currently trying to do a dual military aid deal with both Israel and Ukraine and tie the two. That appears to have some cross-party support. But does it concern you that there are some within the US and within Europe who are questioning the level of military support for Ukraine?
Of course, it's a big concern, but I don't blame those countries. I blame the Russian hybrid warfare that involves informational operations, that involves all kinds of paid opinion makers with hundreds and thousands of subscribers, because Russia can afford that, because Russia has a big oil pipe that can, produce oil and transform it into money and buy people. That will later change the opinion of international community, which is, of course, very, very big challenge. Recently, I had opportunity to meet our colleagues from Netherlands, and I talked to them about this threat, which is tremendously important topic to discuss, because NATO countries at this point they need to understand that if Ukraine falls, if Ukraine is lost to the Russian army, then their countries will be next. And it will not start with Russian bombers or Russian tanks crossing borders. No, it will start on the streets. It will start in YouTube channels, on TV screens. And from there, we will see processes like countries exiting NATO alliance, like countries exiting European Union, and after that, they will see Russian so-called peacekeepers that will be occupying their countries, and they will not be able to defend themselves. So currently, Europe is not, and not only Europe, Western countries, not only they face the challenge of supporting Ukraine, they face the challenge of defending democracy and defending their ordinary lifestyle. That is familiar to them, that is convenient to them, that is beneficial to them, of course. They have this challenge, and of course, Ukraine will do everything to help them and to support them, to teach them how to oppose Russian informational warfare, because Russians invented such thing as propaganda, and they're very, very proficient and very successful using it.
You mentioned earlier the scale of the Russian losses recently, particularly as part of their attacks on Avdiivka. Who is on the Russian front line at the moment? Is it ex-convicts? Is it people who were previously part of the Wagner group? Who is making up the front line for the Russians at the moment?
As usual, they use mix of different units, different types of troops, regular troops, paratroopers, which they consider their elite. And yesterday we had reports that Russians were already bringing remains of Wagner terrorist group to Avdiivka in order to change the situation. And again, it's a very funny moment because, as we remember, after this unsuccessful coup in Russia, Wagnerites were pretty much abandoned, and currently Putin is ready to forgive them if they change the situation in favor of Russia. But again, we will see.
And when on the ground, Ukrainian troops know that they're facing, for example, former Wagner mercenaries who attempted a mutiny not that long ago against the Putin regime, is that a morale boost for the Ukrainians?
Well, there's quite a lot of our guys who still have unfinished business with Wagnerites since Bakhmut, I would say. Um, well, pretty much everything that happens on the front line is our morale boost because we have this very, very dark sort of humor. Um, so yeah, that's the answer.
President Zelensky this week announced the Russian Black Sea Fleet is slowly retreating from the Black Sea. Of course, naval bombardment had been a major threat. Has there been a noticeable drop in attacks after Ukraine's successes striking the Black Sea Fleet?
The most important thing that we noticed is that the ships that can transfer Ukrainian grain to the world can do that more safely. That is a very, very important thing because Russians keep trying to strike Odessa. They use those Onyx missiles fired from Crimean Peninsula, and we have to do everything we can to protect our naval infrastructure because the supplying other countries with our grains, with our food, is one of the most important things that we have to do right now.
But in terms of the success that it appears Ukraine has had recently targeting the Black Sea Fleet, people talk about these sea drones, these underwater drones have been very effective. Is the supply of those an issue?
I would say so. Rather the systematic production of them, but we're working on it, and of course we're developing new drones. Russians creating different countermeasures for them, and of course we have to react. We have to improve them. That's why this process never stops. And yeah, we have quite a few drone models that are very, very successful right now. Versus Russian ships. Probably in the future we'll have more footage to show you from so-called, experiments with Russian naval forces.
We talked about the supply of munitions to Ukraine. Let's just talk about the supply of weaponry to Russia because Sergei Lavrov, the Russia foreign minister, has been in Tehran this week. He's also visited North Korea as well, seemingly to drum up more support from both of those countries to supply weapons to Russia. How concerned are you about that?
Of course, we are concerned because this support, this alliance between terrorist countries, is not only a threat for Ukraine but also a threat for other civilized countries. Iranians were supplying Russians with drones for quite a long time. And even though Ukraine never attacked Iran and never did anything bad to those people, but they keep killing our people for no reason since last year with their Shahed drones and Mohajer drones. So, of course, we are concerned with that. We already saw Russian troops showing off the North Korean artillery. We're talking about 152 millimeter shells, which is big artillery. So yeah, that's a concern for us. On the other hand, again, the Russians had tremendous amount of artillery last year, and they were not able to use it efficiently against Ukrainian targets such as logistic lines, such as our command points, as Ukrainians were able to use our even scarce artillery, but still our strikes on Russian logistics and Russian commanders were very, very successful, what we see today. So it doesn't matter. They can have alliance with, I don't know, Darth Vader, but Ukraine will win because we have no other choice. We have to survive.
Just finally, I want to ask you about reports that Ukraine has set up a new unit of Russian Siberian volunteers, essentially Russians who are volunteering to fight for Ukraine. Have you met any Russians through your own experience who are fighting for Ukraine, and what do you think motivates them to join your cause?
I met them even before the invasion. Actually, I have quite a few friends among Russians who support Ukraine here in Ukraine on the ground and fighting for Ukraine, and they are absolutely amazing people. And of course, what motivates them is the desire to change Russia, to return to their homes. Because a lot of those Russians they had to seek asylum in Ukraine as political refugees. As we know, Russia is not a democratic country. They don't support freedom of speech. They don't support democracy, obviously, because they are being ruled by the same person for 20 years already. And those people, they had to go to Ukraine in order to survive, sometimes with their families. And currently, they see fighting against this current Russian Russiast regime as their chance to return their country. Same as, for example, Chechens who lived all over Europe, who had to retreat from Chechnya after it was occupied by Russians. They see also this war as their chance to return Ichkeria, their homeland. And of course, Ukraine will and is providing all kinds of support to those people because we have the mutual cause of fighting the same invader. And again, those Russians are absolutely beautiful and amazing people, and we support them with all we can.
And how many Russian volunteers are we talking about? Is it dozens? Is it hundreds? Is it more than that?
More than hundreds. Much more than
so
hundreds.
Thousands of Russian volunteers are fighting for Ukraine.
Plus minus.
Wow. Operator Starsky, we always appreciate your insights, your analysis, your expertise. Thank you so much for joining us today on Frontline.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for watching this episode of Frontline for Times Radio. For more on the war in Ukraine, subscribe to the Times Radio YouTube channel. Listen to Times Radio on your digital radio, or you can read the Times online with your digital subscription or in print. Thank you and goodbye.